she became an anchorite, which is a little cell on a church. And I think that was the most shocking and appalling thing that I've heard. Like, I was like, oh my gosh, are you serious? Like, she just lived in a little cell at the church.
Yep.
That's, I don't know. I was like, I can't go that far. That's crazy. That's like, how do you do that?
I know. It is totally wild. And you go, I mean, being an anchorite is really baffling, because it was, the bishop would come and do the liturgy for the dead over you because you were dying to the world.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact and donate. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go leave a rating and review. It's easy. It only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit 5 stars. It really is that easy. So thank you so much for doing that. Also, join us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Threads, anywhere you find social media. We're at Shifting Culture Podcast. Just go and follow us. I post a lot of quotes and video clips of the podcast. You would really enjoy it. So join me on social media. Previous guests on the show have included Jessica Hooten-Wilson, Karen Swallow-Pryor, and Jen Pollock-Michelle. You could go back, listen to those episodes and more. But today's guest is Grace Hamman. Grace Hamman is the author of Jesus Through Medieval Eyes, Beholding Christ with the Artists, Mystics, and Theologians of the Middle Ages, and independent scholar of late medieval poetry and contemplative writing. Her work has been published by academic and popular outlets, including Plough Quarterly and the Journal of Medieval and Early Modern Studies. Grace hosts a podcast called Old Books with Grace, which celebrates the beauty and joy found in reading the literature and theology of the past. She lives near Denver, Colorado, with her husband and 3 children. Grace and I get into a really great conversation around the medieval period and how Jesus was viewed. It's amazing to me how illuminating it is to read thinkers of the past and how it shapes my perspective in ways that are unexpected, and it helps me encounter Jesus in new ways. We talk about people like Thomas Aquinas and Julian of Norwich, and we look at Jesus as a knight, as judge, as mother, and more. Join us as we gain a fresh perspective by encountering the past and looking at Jesus through medieval eyes. Here's my conversation with Grace Hamman. Grace, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to have you on.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, if I do a mistake and say Jesus through Middle Eastern eyes, I apologize, because
I know.
we
Yes.
use that, the book, the Kenneth Bailey book, Jesus through Middle Eastern eyes, to train missionaries. And so we use it all the time. And so now I'm looking at your book, Jesus Through Medieval Eyes, and the very beginning is so similar. It's just getting to me. It's tough.
It's true. It's true. Yes. The Kenneth Bailey book. I've seen it pop. I haven't read it myself, but I see it pop up when you type in Jesus Through. So.
Yes. Yeah, Jesus Through, and there it is. But I really like looking at Jesus through medieval eyes. It's very interesting. It's something that I think a lot of people pass over because, medieval also, people like, oh, so the Dark Ages. We're post-Enlightenment. Like, what did they know? But there's a lot of incredible things that you get out of the theologians and artists and mystics and things of the medieval period. Why are you attracted to this period, and what is it about the medieval era that makes you come alive?
It's a great question. And yes, you're so right. People normally have a fairly negative assumptions and thoughts about this era. And I totally shared that too. I totally believed that it was a period of corruption and superstition and we're better now and blah, 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 all that stuff. And then in graduate school, when I actually started reading them for myself, my background is in English literature, and I started reading the poetry and the contemplative writing of the Middle Ages in Middle English. And I was shocked because I began to realize that Jesus was everywhere in these. And now keep in mind, too, that this was during my master's degree when I was at a giant state university in a very, very secular English department. And yet Jesus was everywhere. You could not get away from him reading these. You had to take them and their love and their passion for Christ very seriously. And it was such a breath of fresh air. And I had made so many assumptions about them. And so then I had to re-examine all of that and go, what am I missing? Why did I feel that way? And I just got deeper and deeper into them and started paying attention to their art and their theology beyond the beautiful poetry that I was reading. And it was such a gift to me. And that's how I got obsessed with the Middle Ages in a nutshell.
All right. Well, I love that. And I love that what reading something different does to you, like reading something that is unexpected and it moves into different eras. How can we start to open our own eyes and minds as contemporaries of our age now by reading something that feels very foreign to us? What does it do to us? What does it do to our minds? How does it reshape the way that we think?
So this is a question I'm keenly interested in. And I think we are used to approaching texts from the past suspiciously, sort of side-eyeing them. Okay, is this going to be up to my standards? And that's true whether we are Christian or not Christian. We all do it in different ways. And so the first thing to do as you are approaching these texts and voices of the past is to approach them with a spirit of openness and willingness to listen. Just like, so my husband always makes fun of me because I call them my friends, which is very nerdy, but these are my medieval friends. But it's like you do when you're getting to know someone in a friendship. You're keeping your heart open to them. You're not jumping to conclusions about them. I mean, it would be a really bummer thing and torpedo any sense of relationship you had with somebody if you approach all people, especially somebody you're trying to understand, with a sense of suspicion. And it's the same with the books of the past and with the art of the past and the people of the past. And so beginning to cultivate a spirit of humility of, okay, I may be wrong. I may have made some assumptions about things that I didn't actually know. And you might know something that I don't know. And I'm ready to listen and then it will eventually turn back the other way where I too know things that you don't know. And so reading becomes more like a dialogue and more transformative in your own heart when you can approach the writers of the past in this way. And that's true whether you're reading medieval era texts or early church texts or 19th century texts. It's the same process. And so it's a real gift when you can begin to cultivate that openness.
Well, if you're cultivating openness and it's more like a dialogue, you're dialoguing with your friends and learning from them. That reminds me of Jesus is the Word chapter in this book, and Thomas Aquinas, as he's talking about dialectic theology. What does it look like to have this conversation, to answer with high scholarship language, and to get it right. As you were looking through the dialectic, the Summa, as Thomas Aquinas was writing, what struck you with that? What struck you with the way that he was dialoguing with people and with the past and with theological answers?
Yeah. So, when I took a Thomas Aquinas class for the first time and picked up, the Summa takes up its own whole shelf on the bookcase. It is a massive work, and you open it up and you look at his structure. he begins with questions. And that already is really interesting, because when we think of a lot of theology writing today, we think of somebody who's giving us an answer to something right away, right? We're looking for that definitive answer. And so he's beginning with a question, and then with all these his contemporaries and with people in the church before his own time, he is basically having a very intense conversation with them, where his answer to the question, he doesn't even give you until he's given other answers that have been answered in the past that he doesn't necessarily agree with, but they're some of the best alternates to his own answer. So it'd be like, imagine today a politician who tells you all of their opponents and all of their like past people they're arguing with, whether they're friends or not, their best and greatest points before actually telling you what he thinks. So there's this really high level of honesty and of willingness to wrestle, willingness to still disagree. He's disagreeing with them, but he's not, giving himself this sort of cheap points in order to make his own point and make sure you agree with him. And so that's the process of dialectic. And it also means that the conversation can be ongoing. So if you're framing all of your theological inquiry as a question that is still open for other people to answer, then the conversation can continue long after you're dead. And that's what has happened with Thomas Aquinas' theology, is that people are still debating some of these points hundreds and hundreds of years later. And so it's this really wonderful model of humility, but also not just saying, not just being content with whatever works, but diving into truth together.
How does that impact the way that we interact as the body of Christ and interact with these questions in church and in church community? What does that look like today? Is it because I know that, growing up in the evangelical church and being in evangelical churches, we're kind of obsessed with the answer. And we want to know the truth. And, we're word-based people. We're going to find this truth in the Bible, and I'm going to tell you the right answer. So how does that then start to help shape and form our understanding of what it looks like to engage in a church body and community today?
So one way that immediately occurs to me is that I think that it would be a grace and a gift for all of us if we grew more comfortable with questions rather than immediately jumping to answers. So letting the question linger, letting ourselves be uncomfortable with it, and not, I think we're so, and myself included, I totally relate to what you're saying, where you really do want the answer and you want it right away and you want it to be straightforward. And Jesus didn't give his disciples that in the Gospels. And Thomas Aquinas doesn't give his folks that, where he writes answers, but you have this long process of wrestling. And so I think that if we as a church can become more comfortable with questions, both asking them and just sitting with them and letting things be complicated, I think that would be a great gift for our hearts and for the ways in which we have conversations with people who don't believe the same things we do. It becomes more invitational to other people, and there's a space and a room there that if somebody who is asking questions and who wants to know more but isn't ready to come to the same conclusions as you, it invites them into a conversation and a journey together in a way that when you have the answers immediately, that doesn't exist.
Yeah. I mean, we often tell people that truth that we discover for ourselves through dialogue and questions and research is going to stick longer than if I just hear the answer from somebody. And so I think that's an important thing as we're wrestling with what does it look like to impact our lives today of what he is doing. One of the things that struck me in that chapter was, at the end of his life, a few months before he died, he gave up the writing, and he's like, what I just experienced, like, I don't have an answer for. I can't actually put it down. What was that experience for him, and why did he decide to put his writing aside?
So towards the end of his life, Thomas has this sort of vision during the Eucharist, the sacrament of the Eucharist, and he doesn't really explain to anyone what it was, but it was this moment, this spiritual moment for him that he later told his friends, everything I've done is straw compared to this. And I think that's what is something that is really beautiful and wonderful about Thomas's work, is that he really is the premier Western theologian of the Middle Ages, not counting Augustine, who's sort of on the precipice of the Middle Ages and patristic theology. But Thomas is incredible, and he wrote and wrote and wrote. He was producing the equivalent of multiple novels a month of like extremely high quality theology. I mean,
That's
it's crazy. It's crazy. And then for him, towards the end of his life, and he wasn't that old, he was, I think, in his 50s, to go, yeah, all of this can't even begin to cover it. And so in him, I see this real response of humility. And also we see the sort of paradox of like the theological pursuit, basically, which is that you can write and write and write and produce, and it can be glorious and beautiful and influential and true in a lot of ways, and it still will fail to capture the majesty of the Godhead and the truth of the Godhead. And so I really appreciate that from such an eminent theologian.
As I was reading through your book, the thing that really struck me was it felt like the medieval period and this time and this place, it felt like, well, one, that Christ was everywhere. Like it was like he just saturated the culture and, you know, the art and the literature, and he was just there. But it felt like an embodiment of Jesus, like their lives were an encounter with Jesus and not just, you know, theological treatise on Jesus or thoughts about Jesus. And, you know, in my modernity, we like to know that we have all the right answers and we get the truth from inside of ourselves. And it feels like in here, Jesus is the one that is encountering them, that's the thing that really propels them forward. And it's that, I mean, one of the ones was Julian of Norwich. And she, you know, as she had her showings, she became an anchorite, which is a little cell on a church. And I think that was the most shocking and appalling thing that I've heard. Like, I was like, oh my gosh, are you serious? Like, she just lived in a little cell at the church.
Yep.
That's, I don't know. I was like, I can't go that far. That's crazy. That's like, how do you do that?
I know. It is totally wild. And you go, I mean, being an anchorite is really baffling, because it was, you know, the bishop would come and do the liturgy for the dead over you because you were dying to the world. I mean, and the funny thing is that it sounds so isolating, but then you actually became this cornerstone of your community. So Julian, people would travel to visit her and to seek out her spiritual guidance and her prayers because she was, by being literally in the fabric of the church, embedded in the church, she was intimately a part of every aspect of parish life. And so she was there at every single liturgy, every single service. And her job, her vocation was to pray for everybody in that space. So she was so intimately connected to space, like you're saying with this embodiment stuff. It goes so much beyond the the mind and being able to make sense of things, because really being an anchorite just doesn't make sense to us, and I don't think it would or will. Like,
No. Like, yeah, okay, she was she was involved in every aspect of the parish, but only through a little window through her
Yep.
cell. Like, she wasn't really like, she was an onlooker of it. Like, so I'm sorry. I don't know. I can't get over it.
That's fair. That's fair.
It's also very inspiring. Like, how can I get to a place of, I just want Jesus. I'm going to give it all up for him. I've had this encounter and this experience of him, and I'm going to then just give it all up, and I'm going to sit here and contemplate and then write and give my life to prayer. It's also really inspiring. It's just something, I can't imagine ever doing it, but it is inspiring. As you were reading this, what really struck you with Julian of Norwich when you have been reading her and walking in her shoes?
Wow, that's a great question, because I got to say, Julian of Norwich is my favorite of all the medieval writers, and she's the one that has her influences in every single chapter of this book, even when she's not explicitly there. Her theology and her writing have shaped my own thinking so much and my own spiritual journey. But I think what Julian has showed me so much is the character of God's love. So Julian is truly the most profound theologian I've read on the closeness and the character of Christ. And so you mentioned the Jesus as a mother chapter, and this is one of those chapters that at first people feel very strangely about. It sounds so odd, and it sounds almost New Age or something like that. And then you begin to realize that, okay, these monastic writers who were first picking up on this language in the Gospels and in wisdom literature were fascinated by what compassionate leadership looked like. What, in a world where it was, a heavily patriarchal society, it wasn't like they honored women more than we do today or anything like that. But masculine authority was viewed as so more like a judge, right? Or more in power and the disciplinarian of relationships. So that was how masculine authority was commonly understood. And so when they found this mothering imagery in the Gospels and in parts of wisdom literature, they jumped on it because they were like, this is an example of how we can think about compassion. And somebody like Julian picks up this theme in being born again and in Jesus doing things like washing people's feet and caring for their bodily health, things that had long been associated with motherhood. And she begins to think about it in terms of how close Christ is to us and how much he loves us on a personal, deep and intimate level, how a nursing mother is caring for her child, or how a mother labors. And in the Middle Ages, labor and pregnancy were much, much more lethal and dangerous than they are now. And so this comparison between Christ on the cross laboring for our salvation was super meaningful to people, putting his life out there for our lives to bring us to life. And so she writes just the most beautiful theology of the intimacy of Jesus that is signified by a mother and a nursing needy child. And that has meant so much to me on a personal level that the chapter can't even really begin to express. So,
So what does it look like for us then to view Jesus as mother? Like, how would it change the way that we interact with Jesus and see him and our relationship with him?
Well, I can't speak necessarily to other people, but I think for me, it changes a couple things. One is that obviously, this is a metaphor, and it's not talking about Christ's earthly body, but that feminine imagery is part of the character of Jesus is a really big deal for me as a woman. And I think is a big deal for other people too, and should be a big deal for men too, because you go, oh, I can't claim full identification with Jesus. The women in my life can too, you know? And so I think that's one really important and beautiful thing where how we are able to follow Jesus and see our love as similar to his is expanded by this vision. And then the other thing is that for me, it has changed how I approach Christ in confession. And so not even like sacramental confession, but just confession as, okay, I've screwed up. I did something or failed to do something that I shouldn't have done. And this image, Julian really associates it closely with how Jesus feels about us after we fail, where the language of motherhood allows her to express that, look, with a mother's little children, she's going to want to be there even closer when you've fallen, when you are in pain, when you are hurt, and when you have hurt other people. Christ's maternal love allows us to really concretize the idea that, oh, God already loves you. He is closer than your own skin. Jesus has carried you in his body, and you are more beloved to him than you can even begin to imagine, just as a little baby is so beloved to her mother. And so that what metaphors like that can do for us is they give us a picture that is hard to express literally, but we all because we all have mothers, regardless of whether you're a mother or not, we all know the feeling of need for your mother to be close from when we were kids. And if you had a mother who was, you know, a loving mother, you know the feel of being held tight after you've fallen, and that is the feeling after we've fallen in sin or in our failures is a huge deal, and shapes the whole of how we can confess our sins and can face what we've done and not hide from what we've done.
I think that's a beautiful invitation for us as to view Jesus as mother and to see that he is as close as our own skin, that he loves us so much that he's going to be with us when we fail and fall. And oftentimes, I know in the West, we primarily see God as judge. And in this book, you have a whole chapter on Jesus as the judge. And so now let's contrast the mother image to the judge image as you go in there. And what does it look like to encounter the fear of God and to know that there is this judge as well, that Jesus, yes, is mother, but Jesus is also judge.
Yeah, this was a very interesting chapter for me to write. It was one of the most difficult chapters because I was, to be honest, I was kind of dreading it because it's a scary image, and it's one that you can see handled rather poorly. I definitely have met my share of very, very angry, street preachers or whoever who really want to tell you how you're going straight to hell, and you're like, you don't even know me. Why are you saying that? But so there's a lot of baggage around this image. And so I came to this and started paying attention. Now, the image and theology of Jesus as a judge was everywhere in the Middle Ages. One of the most popular representations of Christ in art was Christ as eternal king or Christ on Judgment Day. And it was in all the churches and in private devotional materials. It was all over the place. So it was something they were reckoning with. And I began to think about the weirdness that we are called to a fear of God, that the scriptures tell us that fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And And then you begin to notice the places where even the disciples are fearful of Jesus. And in some of them, so for instance, him calming the storm, and he's do not be afraid. But then in others, so after Jesus raises the daughter, and they're afraid, and nobody says anything, and it's just a different kind of fear, a fear of power. And so I began to think about how fear is actually a necessary attribute for us as humans. Now, if you're setting God out of the equation for a moment, it's a bad thing when people are not afraid enough of certain things. So, for instance, to be callous and sort of nonchalant about the ocean, it is a mistake, a huge mistake. Or about if you have a terminal illness, or if you are with a wild animal. If you were just sort of cavalier about your bear encounter, that was going to be a problem for you. And I began to think about how fear is a gift for us in recognizing our human limitations as we face something that is much bigger, much more powerful, and often super beautiful in its power and glory, and how that's even different for us than awe or respect, though we often try to tame the biblical language by saying, no, it means awe or respect. But and it is very close to that. But there's also something else. There's that moment of I'm tiny and fragile, and I need to be aware of that, and that's important. And so in these images of Jesus as a judge, I don't think that we're called to be terrified of him as in this sort of frenzy of self-loathing, or that, oh my gosh, he hates me, or any of those, some of the ways that this imagery can go easily, but that we are called to remember, oh, I am so tiny and small, and he is so big, and I don't fully understand him, and the goodness of remembering who I am in that, and then at the same time, that I am held beloved and closer than the skin. I mean, this is why these images work together, is because they're all reminding us of different facets that are really hard for us to hold at once. It's so hard to hold those things all at once.
Yeah, they're really hard. So what helps us start to hold these things? I think we, in our modern day, we're pretty literal people. I know that, here they're talking about allegory and metaphor and different arts and creativity, the things that there's a mystery of what this looks like. How can we start to hold things and shed some of our literalness and move into mystery?
That's such a good question. I think one way that we can do that, and this is a very obvious answer, one way that I've done it is by keep on reading these people of the past who believe slightly different, or at least state things differently than I do or than you do. So that's one way, is that if you are, C.S. Lewis calls it the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through your mind. And if you kind of have this movement of beauty and wonder and strangeness that is sort of, rippling the waters, so to speak, so that you don't get stuck in the image that you gravitate towards the most. I think that's one really helpful way. Another thing is that I think the church should embrace the power of figurative language more and become more comfortable with storytelling and parables, like how Jesus told. We, like you said, we love our literality. We love our, here are the 3 bullet points that you take home with you from Sunday service, and that's good too. There's a place for that I really believe in. But then we tend to ignore kind of all the weird other stuff, like the storytelling that's open-ended, or the lives of the saints that are confusing, because some of it they seem to have really right, and some of it they seem to be way off base. And so the more we can lean into those tensions, and I think, and the storytelling of that, I think the more it will help us to see fuller pictures of who we are and who God is, and the shapes of different people's lives than our own.
Let's jump into the 20th century quickly. And I just want to know why, as somebody, as Tolkien is kind of a medievalist. He loves the medieval era. Lord of the Rings is very medieval-esque. And I think Lord of the Rings has had a profound impact on our thinking, our culture, and it has lasted a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's lasted a lot more than, I think, non-medievalist type of literature. Why do you think that is? Why do you think somebody from a more modern era harkens to the things of the past, and it actually gives us a huge impact and makes us think in ways that we're not used to?
I think so. You see that in Tolkien, and you see that in C.S. Lewis too, who was also medievalist. They were both medievalists, and they were drawing on all this literature of the past and on the language of the past in both of their great works, in the Chronicles of Narnia and in the Lord of the Rings, which has, to totally agree with you, has like totally shaped my own life in a huge way. I mean, I love both of those books, and especially the Lord of the Rings. I think that they both spoke, that especially Tolkien too, I think he spoke to to human experience beyond our own time and place. So you read some books and you go, oh, this was definitely just written straight out of our present moment for people in our present moment. There's not that much feeling behind it or before it necessarily. And those books can be really fun to read. But somebody like Tolkien, what he was doing is that he was looking at the past as it speaks to us now, and then putting it into fiction in ways that even somebody who had no idea what Beowulf was, which was one of Tolkien's most influential poems in Old English that he, adored and taught about, even if they never had encountered or read Beowulf, some of the themes of Beowulf are present in Lord of the Rings, and giving them to an audience in a sort of transformed way, bringing in some of those elements of the past, and especially things that speak to our sort of universal human experience, rather than just being exclusively 20th century post-World War II, we're all worried about X, Y, and Z, whatever. So it has this sense of universality because it's drawing together 9th century epic and 20th century genre writing. And so it really gives us such a gift, because even though it's fiction written in the 20th century, it draws on all these themes that are thousands of years old. And I think that's why I think we sense that as we read, and we feel the depth there, and it feels different to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's very deep. One of the chapters I loved is Jesus is the night. A night,
lots of Tolkien there.
Lots of Tolkien there in the night. But a night is such a vivid image from the medieval period. What does it look like for Jesus to be a knight? I've never thought of Jesus as knight before I read your book. So what does that look like? How did you come across that? And what impact did that make in your life?
Yeah, Jesus as a knight was such an interesting one, because at first, I'll be honest with you, I was a little resistant to that image, just like I was with the judge, because as a medievalist, I associate knighthood with like the Crusades, or with knights. For us today, they are a character in like a fairy tale, basically. But for people back then, that was a real social class. That was an actual group of people who were wealthy, who were the landowners, and who sometimes did really great things for the people they were in charge of, and sometimes were really corrupt and violent. And so it is really interesting portraying Jesus as a specific figure in a social class. And how I kind of was able to see the beauty of it is in this poem called Piers Plowman, which is written in the 14th century by this poet named William Langland. And he, the last bit of Piers Plowman, which is a very, very long epic poem, sets the events of Holy Week into an allegory of knighthood. And so Jesus as a knight is jousting with the enemy. And what makes it even weirder and more interesting is that Jesus is a knight, but he's dressed as a plowman. And so Langland is just taking all of these social stereotypes. And of course, plowmen were peasantry. And I mean, they were a knight in the Middle Ages would have never wanted to dress as a plowman because they were a much lower social class and much less powerful than knights were. And so Langland is actually writing a picture of the humility of the incarnation and the universality of the incarnation in this knight turned plowman who's still jousting and fighting our enemies. And it is just he calls him the barefoot knight. And then in another Middle English poem, we see Jesus saying, "I am Jesus come to fight without shield or spear," and that gives that same idea of this image of courage and fortitude and endurance and bravery, but it doesn't come in the forms we expect it to. And I really, really love that.
Yeah, that's amazing that you found something that we could take a hold of. What does it look like to be a powerful fighter like Jesus and fight for justice, and which is opposite of like the Crusades. The Crusades, created so much damage around the world, and
yes, and we're still dealing with the fallout of that.
And we're still dealing with the fallout. I mean, as I worked in the Middle East for years, and I talked to a lot of Muslims about Jesus, and I had to deal with the fallout of the Crusades. Like
personally, you had to deal with the fallout.
I had to deal with the fallout of the Crusades. It is just like, I have to apologize. I have to.
This was bad.
It was horrible.
So sorry.
I know.
I'm so sorry.
It's really bad. So it's such a relief to see Jesus coming in. Like, there is a place of justice, and knowing that they are the people, artists are critical of what was happening at that time as well. And it wasn't just, I'm going to give in to this horrific barbarian killing of and massacring of people, but I'm going to actually say Jesus calls us to a different way and a better way, and he's the plowman, and it's pretty incredible to be able to see that.
No, it's unbelievable that Langland comes up with this elaborate sort of allegory on allegory. I mean, it is just a wonderfully weird and beautiful poem, and then this, and you really begin to see its resonances. Like, you think of, for me, as I'm reading it, I'm thinking of the lives of Martin Luther King Jr., of somebody who was a genuine fighter for justice, but who was so committed to nonviolence and to a different kind of fighting than what we had seen before. And so it just is so true to the character of Christ in a way that is encouraging.
Is there any other chapter or any aspect of Jesus that you wrote that really impacted you and you really love that we haven't mentioned yet?
Oh, I don't know. You've really hit on a lot of the high points for me, but I would say the other thing that medieval people have helped me see is the temptation to think you're right all the time. And we all have that in every era of the church, and it's easier to see it in someone else's time period. So I have a chapter called Jesus, the Good Medieval Christian, where Jesus is written as if he's in their own culture and in, just fitting seamlessly right in with the kinds of ideals and beliefs that the medieval church held. And for us, we read that and go, that seems obviously wrong, but we're doing the same thing. And just that is such a genuinely important exercise, and something that I have thought about a lot since doing that research and writing.
So how do we engage in that exercise then, and realize that today we may be making a lot of mistakes, but we think that we have, to be honest, I think we're like, hey, we have thousands of years of learning on top of learning on top of learning, and we're at the top of the mountain, right? We're the pinnacle, and that's a lot of hubris. And, great is the fall of the one that is going to engage in that.
Yes.
So how can we engage in a place of saying we may not have all the right answers, and we can learn from the people of the past, and we need to move into new directions and not just put Jesus or like put a box on Jesus and say, this is who he is?
Yeah, I think there's not an easy answer to that question. And I think a lot of it is in the actual just literal boring old practice of whenever you are coming up against something that is really different than you or really challenging a belief or an expectation of yours, that you have to hold that intention and say, I probably don't know the complexities of this. And that sounds so weird and basic, but I'm thinking of, listening to people who are really different than you and who believe different things than you. And even when you don't like what they're saying, and just trying to give it space enough to challenge what you believe. And I think sometimes we're really afraid to do that because we're afraid it's going to challenge our faith or challenge our orthodoxy or something, like whatever we're holding on to tight. But if Jesus is saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life, which he is, we don't have to be afraid of truths challenging us and showing us where we have been wrong, that there will be a graciousness in it for us that won't be foreseen, basically. And to keep reading the books of the past, I think, is a huge part of that, because you just see these things that they were so convinced of. And so you go, okay, well, I have this X thing that I am just so convinced of. And I still have to be careful. I have to hold, and this is where, the judge comes back in, where you're like, I'm just one little person. And that doesn't change, even though my culture might have discovered X and we might be doing AI and we might be, more advanced than any other blah, blah, blah. But what it boils down to is me in my body, in my mind, in my heart. I am just me, and I'm small. And that's not a bad thing. That's a really good thing. The Lord made me that way. I don't need to be afraid of that. But I also then have to hold it and not get cocky.
That's good, Grace. I have a couple questions at the end. One, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Ooh, oh my gosh. Okay. I think that I would say, don't be afraid. And just keep following the strange threads that you're interested in. And I did do that, but there was a lot of fear and some embarrassment wrapped up in it. I was doing something that was not very practical at all. And that, wasn't going to lead to a lot of lucrative career paths for me or anything like that. And I felt embarrassed of it. And on the other end of the spectrum, like, I wasn't doing something that felt immediately useful to the church. So I felt really guilty about that too. And so saying, this is going to bring fruit that you don't know, and you just have to keep following those weird things. And I think that's what I would say to myself. Don't have fear about that. The Lord has given you these curiosities.
That's really good advice. Keep following the weird things.
Yeah, I think for most people it ends up being really fruitful in a humble way, not in like, I don't know, but yeah.
I agree. I think that's great. Really good advice. Have you read anything lately or watched anything lately you recommend?
Oh, good question. That's such a big question, because I'm honestly constantly reading, and so it's an endless. That's like my favorite thing in the world to do. I would say I've been revisiting. Sorry to just keep going back to the past, but I've been revisiting the works of the metaphysical poet and theologian Thomas Traherne lately. He was a 17th century Anglican cleric, and he has these beautiful thanksgivings and these wonderful poems that are just absolutely charged with gratitude for creation. and I have been so delighted by them. I mean, you could just hear his delight, and delight is contagious. When you're reading someone who's delighted in what they are encountering, you're delighted, And so that's one thing. Something that is way less serious and more modern day is that my husband and I have been watching Only Murders in the Building on Hulu, which has been a very light, I mean, it's not like 'cause it's about murders, obviously, but it's murder mystery. And it has just been a really nice counterbalance. It's not like the most amazing show I've ever watched or anything like that, but a nice little counterbalance to some of the seriousness of daily life. So that's a fun one. So you have a more serious one and a fun one. There
that's
you go.
good. I love Only Murders in the Building. It's a lot of fun. It's as light as murder can be.
Yeah, that's right.
It's good. Grace, I loved your book, Jesus Through Medieval Eyes. I was captivated by actually stepping back in time and seeing Jesus through other people's eyes and saying that he could encounter me this way.
Mm-hmm.
He could encounter me as mother, as knight, as judge. He could encounter me as all of these things. And I really, really appreciated it. And I hope that people go out, they read it, they get it, and it gets them interested in reading more theologians and more people who have written literature in the medieval period, so that they could have their minds opened up and expanded, and we can start to learn from our past, and we can move forward. How can people go out and get your book? I'm sure it's available anywhere, but where would you like to point people to, and how can people connect with you? Where would you like to point people to?
Oh, great. So you can get the book anywhere that you like to buy your books. Obviously, I got to put in a plug for your local bookseller. If you have a local bookstore that you like, you can either see if it's on their shelves or you can order it from them. But it is also, of course, available on Amazon. And I actually saw it at Barnes & Noble yesterday. That was very exciting for me. That was my first time seeing it out in the wild, and it was thrilling. But yeah, you can get it at any of those places. And then as far as finding me online, I'm on Instagram at Old Books with Grace. I'm on what was formerly called Twitter at Grace Hamman, Ph.D. And probably the two more fun places to find what I'm up to is I have a Substack newsletter that comes out once a month on different medieval and medieval adjacent and literature of the past topics, and it's called Medievalish with Grace Hamman, and that's one of my favorite things to do. And then I have a podcast called Old Books with Grace that is literally what the title says. I have different guests come on to talk about old books with me, and it's really fun. So those are all the places.
That's great. I have listened to Old Books with Grace, and I've really enjoyed it. So I recommend people go out and check out your podcast, subscribe to your Substack, and then go out and get Jesus Through Medieval Eyes. So, Grace, thank you so much for this conversation. It was illuminating, enlightening. It was a lot of fun. And so thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me on. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.